Okay, in this interactive video, we are going to talk about some of the most influential ideas of Karl Jaspers. And as a warning, Jaspers is very difficult and challenging to understand, as you'll see. But the reading that I've picked for Jaspers this week is one of the more accessible ones, and it's about Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. So I didn't pick a super gnarly one, but we're going to go over some gnarly concepts here. Take from it what you can and what you want. And otherwise, if it seems just too bizarre or incomprehensible, don't worry about it that much or pursue some more on your own. Okay, here we go. So we'll start with a quick biography video. It's not one of those cool school of life or crash course ones because they just didn't make one for Karl Jaspers, probably for the reason that I just described to you. But there is this one. So we'll watch this for a few minutes first.
Karl Jaspers was a German philosopher and psychiatrist. He was one of the chief proponents of existentialism, a movement concerned with the meaning and limits of human existence. Jaspers was born in Oldenburg, Germany, on February 23, 1883. In 1908, he graduated with a degree in medicine and in 1909 began working at a psychiatric clinic in Heidelberg. But Jaspers was dissatisfied with the accepted way of treating the mentally ill. He presented his own theories in a 1913 study entitled General Psychology. He felt that most of the scientific and medical community lacked the expertise to understand mental illness. Science depended on objective data, but mental illness concerned man's inner self and touched his whole being. Jaspers decided to abandon medicine for philosophy. He believed that only philosophy could study man in its entirety. He began to teach the subject at the University of Heidelberg. In 1919, he published The Psychology of Worldviews, considered one of the first existentialist works. In 1932, he published his chief work entitled Philosophy. Jaspers believed man was unique. Unlike other creatures, man has a conscience and is free to make his own choices. Yet man is not completely free, and some situations can even render him powerless. For example, Jaspers believed man cannot avoid inflicting pain on others and was thus forever bound to a feeling of guilt. Man also has no say in being born. He is tossed into life and cannot do anything to stave off death. Jaspers saw these limits as walls that enclose human existence. Man senses something lying behind the walls, but can do nothing to overcome them. Jaspers viewed man's existence as tragic. In the very moment man senses truth exists, he also realizes it is inaccessible to him. Unlike the scientist who trades in explanations, the philosopher cannot reassure man as to his condition because there is no hope to offer. The philosopher can only pose questions, but despite this limit, he eventually comes to understand more than the scientist. Thus, according to Jaspers, philosophy becomes ethics. For him, ethics places life between awareness of one's limits and the difficulty in accepting them. With the rise of Nazism in Germany, Jaspers had to abandon teaching because his wife, Gertrude Meyer, was Jewish. But when the war ended in 1945, he returned to teaching. In 1948, he moved to Basel, Switzerland. Jaspers died there on November 26, 1969. He was 86.
So that did a pretty decent job of introducing us to Carl Jaspers and a few of his bigger ideas. In addition, so he was the first to discuss Kierkegaard and Nietzsche like as a pair and as harbingers of what was to come, kind of like soothsayers of what we might expect in the future. He also coined the term existence, meaning the properly human way of existing. And he approached the subject from man's direct concern with his own existence. And it's something he named Existenzphilosophie, which is a forerunner to the term existentialism. He focused on how to study the problem of existence without objectifying man or resorting to the artificial depth of mysticism. He really struggled with um, bridging those two approaches, right? Scientific objectivity versus absolute subjective and borderline mysticism. We know these couple of things from the biography, and here's a sampling of his works and original books, publications. So, on Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, so as the Nazi regime was strengthening its grip on German society and culture in 1935, Jaspers spoke the following at a public lecture. Regarding the situation of philosophizing as well as of real life, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche articulate the impending calamity which at that time no one had become aware of, but which became clear to them. And that calamity was the devaluing of what Jaspers called existence for the sake of a naive form of scientific knowledge, arguably a major contributor to the Holocaust in the sense of seeing people as objects, objectifying human existence, right? As things, humans are things to be studied and quantified and and also qualified in the sense of sorting into categories of better and worse, correct? And you can see how that might be a contributor to the Holocaust. Jaspers was saying that it was this mindset, this way of viewing human existence was predicted, sensed by Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and they in a sense predicted the Holocaust without saying it in so many words. Jaspers claimed that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche were able to criticize systematic accounts of existence without slipping into irrationalism, and with due respect for both the power and limits of reason to guide our lives. This is a quote. Here's Carl Jaspers as a young man and then as an older man. And this is a quote from Julius Bixler that I really like and I wanted to share with you because it kind of sets up the complexity and borderline incomprehensibility at times of what we're about to engage in the rest of this presentation. Jaspers' work is in fact an excellent example of one type of German philosophizing where the thinker with great effort draws ideas out of his own intuitive life and then submits them again and again to interpretation in his own private experience, trying to work their meaning out for himself and to live it through personally instead of bringing it before the bar of public criticism. his concern with reality as it unfolds within the self, and with thinking as the constant reinterpretation of inner data. Although he's more interested in science than is Heidegger and came to philosophy after training in psychopathology, he is, like Kierkegaard, an artist in that he strives continually to embody the same form in new material and to reach the aesthetic universal which is embedded in human emotion, as contrasted with the logical universal which is attained through critical analysis. So note what his method is. And again, this may account for how let's say unusual some of what we're about to discuss sounds. He's trying to pull from his own, into looking at himself, regarding his organism as a sense, as a site of where stuff happens, and then taking that intuitive data and running it through rubrics of interpretation and trying to put a language behind it that captures human experience from the subjective viewpoint. You know, we're not talking about I feel this and I feel that. What we're talking about is he's trying to put a language, almost to create an understandable objective language for subjective experience, if that makes any sort of sense. So what we'll look at now is the four dimensions of human being, human being, emphasis on the being, according to Jaspers. For him, a human being realizes his or her life and his or her human potentialities in four modes or four dimensions of being. So each one of us, he says, has a different way of being in the world, right? And they're interrelated, but different at the same time. So there are the three aspects of what he'll call empirical being. And then Existenz is something different. So there is Dasein, and by the way, we will see this word again when we get to Heidegger in a couple weeks. Dasein, which is existence in the world, consciousness as such, Geist or spirit, and then there's Existenz. So we'll take each of them in turn. So Dasein, existence, being in the world. The term Dasein or existence is one of the key elements of Jaspers' metaphysical construction of the human being. And in Jaspers' view, man or humankind is the only entity in the world to whom being itself is manifested through his empirical existence. What he's saying is that humankind is the only kind of entity in the entire world that understands being as such, what it means to be, and conversely, what it means to not be. Humankind is the being for whom being itself is actually an issue. A dog does not worry about its being or the nature of being and becoming and not being, and nor does a dolphin, excuse me, or a great ape, right? So this carves humankind out, puts humankind into a special category, not necessarily above and better than everything else, but different. And Dasein, as one of those four modes of being, is a mode of being which manifests itself as one's empirical self in the world, with a temporal dimension, with a time dimension, before, during, after, everyday life, right? Being in the world, being with your baby, taking care of chores, taking care of business, everyday living is just one mode of human being. Not a human being, but the way that we can be, right? We can be Dasein. As a matter of fact, we are Dasein most of the time. Just everydayness. So, in other words, Dasein is man's everyday concrete mode of being amongst other entities, other things in the world, other people in the world. Everydayness. And Dasein is embedded in the world of experience, involved in practical aspects of everyday life, and always in some kind of situation. It's mundane, everyday biological being. That's only one way that we can be. Then another mode of our being, according to Jaspers, is consciousness as such, what he calls it. And it's also related to the empirical aspect of humankind in the world. Empirical meaning observable and studyable. Jaspers describes it as a form of consciousness in which universal truths and objective knowledge can be cognized and, in principle, shared by everyone who has the intellectual capacity to reflect. So, like theoretical science, for instance, logic, math, scientific knowledge in general, right? Where you're abstracted from everyday Dasein, if you will, or everyday being in the world, in the mundane, and you begin to theorize, right? And engage in abstract reasoning and abstract logic, math, science, etc. That he labels consciousness as such. And the concepts and methods concerned in these areas of knowledge are publicly shared, we are capable of it, and verifiable and by extension falsifiable. Okay? That's another way that we can be in the world. Now, by the way, these aren't exclusive. These are aspects of our being, Jaspers would say. So we've got Dasein, which is everydayness, getting stuff done. Then there's this side of us, consciousness as such. Then there's Geist, or spirit, which is also, according to Jaspers, an empirical mode of our being, which is a little bit, when you say spirit, and then you say it seems to contrast directly or be completely oppositional to the notion of empirical being, like what can be studied and what can be publicly shared, right? You would think that spirit or Geist is something that transcends the empirical, but he means something more specific by Geist or spirit. And it's closely connected with both Dasein and consciousness as such. So as spirit, we share the characteristics of being concrete and historical and everyday with Dasein, and its universality is similar to that of consciousness as such, which is, abstract. So spirit can be described as a kind of concrete, universal mode of being in which we're able to comprehend various phenomena in terms of unities. It can also be explained in terms of the drive for wholeness and unity, for coherent totality of all experience. So what spirit's trying to do, or Geist is trying to do within us, it's a mode of our being. It's kind of when we try to bridge that massive gap, or seemingly massive gap, between all of these concrete particular things around us, and then the fact that we universalize and generalize and generate theories and logic, right? When we try to put those together, this kind of drive that we have to not keep those two things separate, but to unify those two modes of being. He calls this Geist. And some examples of these sort of unities, or even organizations that are supposed to promote this sort of unity, or to encourage this mode of our being, would be religion, some political ideologies, and arts and cultural traditions, right? Any of these sorts of organizations or practices that point to humankind's involvement in Geist, or this wanting to kind of unite the particular and the universal, this drive to do it, so that it doesn't seem so um, ontologically disparate. And then the fourth mode of being, according to Jaspers, is something different entirely, existence. So Dasein, consciousness as such, and spirit are the modes of being in which we see ourselves as rooted in the world, and we participate in the worldly events as what he calls possible existence, without any transcendent experiences. And where it starts, I mean, if it wasn't challenging before, it starts to get a little strange now. So remember, those first three modes of being, excuse me, Dasein, consciousness as such, and spirit are empirical modes of being according to Jaspers, right? Just different ways of being in the world. Everydayness, abstract theorizing, and then trying to put them together. And he says, all of these ways of being in the world point to the fourth mode of our existence. They say they indicate possibility, the possibility of this fourth mode that he labels existence, which is a transcendent experience. Existence is the non-empirical and non-objective dimension of the human being. It's an ineffable inner core of the individual. I'm going to actually change this. This implies that it's an empirical thing within you, like that you can touch and measure. Ineffable meaning we can't quite describe it. So it's an ineffable, let's just say, dimension of our being. Also, it's unintelligible in the sense that it defies precise definition, and partly due to the limitation of language and partly to the absence of an object to refer to. It's not concrete. It's not objective and quantifiable and measurable, right? It's ineffable. It's something that is sensed, and that's indicated by these three modes of being according to Jaspers. By the way, particularly where this aspect of this mode of being is concerned, if you go back to that quick video that we watched in the beginning, when you see people like pounding against the concrete wall, like we know there's some kind of truth, but we can't get to it, that speaks a bit to this mode of being. Existence does not refer to any particular individual. And it's not a possession. You can't have it. You can't own it. It's not something you can acquire and then pass off, or acquire and then you have it forever. It's a unique existential possibility which can be actualized, like turned on, in every individual, in that its reality depends on the actual moment of choice and decision. So, in other words, it's not a state that you hit, right, and stay in. I've recognized this transcendent experience of existence, and now I'm staying in it for the rest of my life. I have it, and it's mine, and I'm not giving it away. That's not the way it works, is what he's saying. It's a happening. It happens in specific moments, right? And specifically those where you're making like authentic choices and decisions. And that's not between should I have sushi or a burrito for lunch, right? We're talking about genuine, authentic, life-determining sorts of decisions. This existence will like light up in us. The achievement of existence, or self-being, kind of authenticity, right, indicates one's authentic mode of being. Although this can't be achieved once and for all, like I said, it can be experienced in brief moments in time, or like we might see later with Heidegger, in the twinkling of an eye, he would say. And since the authentic mode of being is difficult to attain, and we often have a tendency to fall back into our everyday, empirical, regular existence, existence remains largely just a possibility, like a looming possibility. It's always there, but rarely, I don't want to say achieved, because that sounds like it's something you get and you hold on to. It's always there looming for us, this experience of existence as a possibility, and we know it. A lot of us fear it, though, he would say, so we flee from it. But some of us embrace it, and then you get to experience it for a few moments, and then you go back into your everyday existence, or theorizing, or trying to bridge the two, just like normal life, right? So existence is always kind of looming there as a possibility, he'd say. So for Jaspers, possible existence provides the ground for freedom of thought and action for one's true self, meaning that it's because this possibility is there. And really, for him, for Jaspers, only because this possibility is there, that we can actually have true freedom of thought and an experience of true self. Otherwise, everything would be determined by by everydayness, by the world of causality, everything around you. Right? If it weren't for this transcendent possibility, our thought and our authentic being would be limited by the empirical. I hope that made some kind of sense, but again, if it didn't, it's okay. I'm just trying to give you some big ideas, especially because we're going to see these come up again in Heidegger. Very quickly, I mean, he knew himself that this was. I'm just so impressed by this. This is his own diagram of the four modes of being. It's done in German, but it and look how hard he's trying to work this out in his own mind, and to make like a objective, transmittable, communicable sense out of something of this nature. This is incredible to me. But anyway, I just wanted to show that to you. So next concept or ideas, and closely, very related, boundary or limit situations. For Jaspers, limit situations or boundary situations are moments usually accompanied by experience of dread, guilt, or acute anxiety, kind of like the take the breath out of you, right? In which the human mind confronts the restrictions and pathological narrowness of its existing forms, and allows itself to abandon the security of its limitedness so as to enter a new realm of self-consciousness. It's when the ground starts to fall away from under you, and you sense it, and you sense these. It's as if, to put it in terms of the four modes of being, existence is kind of calling at you, and you sense how you sense it, and you sense the limitedness of the three empirical modes of being, and this other one is calling at you, and you let it happen rather than scurrying back to the regular empirical world, or even science, right? Or even trying to make the everyday world and science kind of groove together. Instead of running back to that, you allow it to happen, and it's usually accompanied by what this must feel like, right? And in conjunction with this is his theory of the unconditioned. And in this theory, Jaspers argued that limit situations are unconditioned moments of human existence in which reason is drawn by intense impulses. Reason itself, by the way, is drawn by intense impulses or imperatives which impel it to expose itself to the limits of consciousness and to seek higher or more reflected modes of knowledge. Way, way heavy stuff here. Right? What he's arguing, and it's not really arguing, what he's saying is that reason, just the process of reason, reasoning through, deductive reason, inductive reason, call it what you will, reason itself is starting to demand the unconditioned. Reason itself, or your reason is developed enough to understand that it can basically prove two opposite points. And if that's the case, it too is limited. I'll show you what I mean by this very briefly in a second. Reason itself and the process of reasoning through can be used to argue two contrary positions. And once this is recognized, then your reason itself, I'm not talking about you sitting around having a cup of coffee saying, hey, you know, my reason could use a little bit of deconditioning. It's reason itself that says there's something not wrong here, but there must be another level. I don't really know how else to put it, and I don't want to belabor the point because I've already set up, and so have other thinkers, that this is difficult to communicate. But I'll try to make it more clear. The unconditioned is proposed by Jaspers as a vital impetus in reason, in which reason encounters its form as conditioned or limited and desires to transcend the limits of this form, right? Which is what I was trying to say before. But let me give you a really brief example. Kant demonstrated this in the Critique of Pure Reason when he treats the antinomies of reason, which is essentially what he means by antinomies is how they can kind of go against one another. And this is the third antinomy, sorry, where he shows, look, you can reason deductively to reach two opposite conclusions. Number one, that we do have free will, and number two, that we don't have free will. And each of these arguments is perfectly valid, right? So what he's saying is that reason itself will go, man, look, I can use valid deductive reasoning to reach the conclusion that we have free will. And I can use valid deductive reasoning to reach the conclusion that we don't. So there is a limit to reason, in other words, because which is it? Do we have it or do we not? So what Kant was trying to say is that there is a limit to our critical reason, and Jaspers is taking this conclusion of Kant's and developing it further and using it. Another important or influential idea of Jaspers is the encompassing. And that's an elusive being, and that's not being as a thing, but like way of being, right? An elusive way of being, often understood as the totality of consciousness, like the world itself and other forms of determinate objects and every possible mode of reality together as one. Well, how else how even it seems silly to even use language to describe it, but the encompassing, right? Like totality, everything. It looks like Dolly's trying to paint this and the difficulty in expressing an experience or a concept like this. right? It is itself not entirely graspable, and when we try to think of it, it tends to split into its modes and become objectified, which is kind of what I meant by as you start to speak about it, it splinters and it's like, oh, this is a language issue, or now I'm thinking about something specific, right? There's what Jaspers is saying is the encompassing is something, again, that's ineffable. When you try to express it and communicate it in the empirical world, it falls apart and um, disintegrates, and it's cheapened in a sense by language. As a result, we can have access only to its manifestation in its different modes in the world. This, in Jasper's view, highlights our inadequacy of grasping reality as a whole. Only through philosophical thinking, Jasper says, can awareness of the encompassing be indirectly attained and the relationship between subject and object clarified. And this speaks a bit to the quick video we watched in the beginning. So even though that wasn't as good as like a School of Life, I recommend that you go back and watch after this. I recommend you just go back and go to the overview and watch that really quickly again. And some things may pop after this lecture. Authentic existence is the human attempt to push past certain boundary situations and reach the encompassing or transcendence, to push past those three modes of existence, Dasein, consciousness as such, and brain is getting murky. Dasein, consciousness as such, and Geist or spirit, and reach Existenz. Ciphers. Transcendence does not speak to humans as such, doesn't go, hey, humans, I am transcendence, come and meet me, but may speak to them through the code of human awareness in the form of ciphers, Jaspers says. Ciphers are not symbols. Symbols are objects that represent other objects, objectifying them in a symbolic representation. So my example of that's like a skull and crossbones symbolizes death, or poison and death, right? That's a symbol. A cipher is not a symbol, right? It's not saying transcendence. It doesn't symbolize transcendence, because transcendence can't be symbolized in that way. A cipher instead evokes transcendence, which lies beyond the subject-object distinction and is in no representable object. You know, I chose, if you've seen the movie Inception, I chose that one of their little ciphers. I can't remember what they called them in that, a token or something like that. Totem, right? But you know, the totem in Inception is not meant to, like, once you touch it, you're back into the real world, or back into the dream world or whatever. It's an evocation. It's a reminder, right? So look at ciphers kind of like that. Matter of fact, I wouldn't doubt it that the concept of a totem in Inception was borrowed from Jaspers. I don't know that for sure though. A cipher can be quite mundane, serving as a point of focus, revealing some inexpressible aspect of transcendence, like a work of art, a religious myth, a ritual performance, a guttering candle, right? Just like an Inception. Ciphers can make transcendence accessible to us the only way it can be, as like an evocation, but it doesn't reveal transcendence the way that it really is, since transcendence isn't purely objective, right? There's no such way to do that. There's no portal, There's no button you can push. Similar, it's really good to think, like I said, I hope if you've seen Inception, think of those totems as this concept. If you haven't seen it, then no worries. Hopefully, this just makes a little bit of sense. However, no objectivity can secure the truth of the cipher. Only the self can verify its truth as the intimated presence of transcendence. Man, this, to be honest with you, at this point, I mean, and I brushed up on my Jaspers before I recorded this. Jaspers starts to get so gnarly that you begin to understand why a lot of us haven't heard of him when you think of the philosophers. I mean, Nietzsche's much easier than Jaspers. Heidegger's much easier than Jaspers. And we'll study Heidegger later, and you start to realize why, as incredible as of a thinker Jaspers was, why his strict philosophy didn't catch on more than it did. But his writings, his more empirical writings, and he doesn't, let's put it this way, he has a lot of accessible writings that are brilliant, and those are the ones that I assigned for our course. But I mean, I barely even know what this means anymore. Be honest. And finally, then God. Right? Jaspers' theory of ciphers provides a way of philosophically accommodating the ancient, mystically inflected religious idea that we humans are necessarily answerable to an ineffable, transcendent God. Not a being among beings, but the ground and source of being itself. So, in other words, this is a complex way of saying, look, since ancient times, I mean, regardless of the religion, people have been trying to put this idea across, like there's something else. There's something transcendent. Sometimes we give it the name of God. Sometimes we give it the name of nirvana. Sometimes we give it the name of absolute being, right? But this is what this theory, this entire theory of the modes of being and of ciphers and encompassing echoes in religious traditions. This is like Jasper's way of saying it. This idea parallels Jasper's axiom that there's no everyday existence without transcendence, though we can grasp transcendence only imperfectly through its coded language or physiognomy. Always have a hard time with that word. Or as St. Paul would say in the Bible in Corinthians, we can only grasp transcendence through a glass darkly. And that's why I use this image from that movie, A Scanner Darkly, because A Scanner Darkly is taken from Corinthians through a glass darkly. Unlike religious symbols, which must objectify what they aim to symbolize, ciphers are the signs of our inevitable failure to grasp transcendence objectively, though our desire to keep trying to grasp it persists. It'll never go away. So here you can hear Kierkegaard in this absurdity, right? That we long, what Jaspers is saying is we long for this, we sense a transcendence, we long for knowledge of this transcendence. We don't have the language to express it. When we try to express it, it comes out all messy and confusing, right? But we still want to talk about it. We still want to experience it. But it makes no sense in like the everyday world. And this is an absurd condition for us to live in. Like, why do we have to, and why have we, since essentially the dawn of consciousness, had to live this way? Why do we have to constantly sense this thing that this mode of being that will never be able to fully articulate or even render intelligible. It's absurd. But once we come to grips with the absurdity, that's a step towards the transcendence. You don't struggle with the absurdity. You accept it as part of your existence. So I hope that made some sort of sense, everybody. And again, don't never fear, because although all the readings in this course are difficult and challenging, the reading I chose for the Jaspers unit, the readings I chose for the Jaspers unit are his more accessible ones.